While the war rages in Vietnam, Americans at home protest sending their sons and brothers off to war.
Behind government walls exists a top-secret extensive study of war activities, starting in the Truman administration and continuing into Johnson's presidency.
The study contains information that reveals the American government's dishonesty about the war.
Unbeknownst to the public or the government, one man leads the fight against the war through the robbery of these government secrets.
The publication of the top-secret reports, later known as the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, exposed the American government's lies to their people about United States' progress and involvement in the war.
The Supreme Court's ruling in favor of the people and the newspapers was a landmark triumph for transparency that to this day safeguards the public's right to access government information.
I came here to speak to you about Vietnam. I do not have to tell you that our people are profoundly concerned about that struggle.
The year was 1971. The Vietnam War has been raging for 16 years. A study started in 1945 has been looking into the United States' involvement in Southeastern Asia.
America's involvement in the region started under the Eisenhower administration.
There was a great concern, surely in the 1950s, about the Soviet threat, about communism. And by the 1950s, by the early 1950s, China, the Chinese Communist regime, the People's Republic, had come to be playing into that. And there was a concern about all of Southeast Asia. But there was a sense that we had to make a stand someplace. President Eisenhower talked about the dominoes falling.
America has entered with its material power and with its moral commitment. In my opinion, for us to withdraw from that effort would mean a collapse not only of South Vietnam, but Southeast Asia.
Many officials believed it was the responsibility of the United States and other global powers to stop the spread of communism. If they failed to do so, they believed the domino theory would take effect and all other nations in Asia would fall under communist regimes.
However, America's progress in the war was not nearly as successful as the government let off. The U.S. was virtually in a stalemate, although Americans were told that the U.S. was close to success. The main reason that the U.S. even remained in the war was to avoid a humiliating defeat, but this was at the cost of many American lives.
Well, most people who went to Vietnam probably had some real enthusiasm when they went there. We were here to fight the communists. If we don't fight them here, we'll be fighting them in Los Angeles. I have to say that the guys that I interviewed, within a matter of weeks, they had backed off from that. They realized that the South Vietnamese were not happy.
Throughout the course of the war, protesters spoke out against it throughout the nation and even internationally.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
It seemed that there were more people against the war than for the war. The government remained falsely positive about the war for the sake of their pride. In 1971, one man employed by the Rand Corporation spent many months working on a top-secret project. He spent numerous nights copying thousands of pages of confidential files, including a study commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967. These documents exposed the federal government and their lies about the conflicts in Southeast Asia from 1945 to 1970. This man was Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst originally in support of involvement in Vietnam, but changed his mind throughout the course of the war.
Why did I put it out at all? Because by the spring of 1971, I was feeling that with the attack, actually from the fall of 1970, with the Son Tay raid, I saw the escalation which had been foreshadowed in Cambodia as speeding up and moving toward probably an all-out escalation, which I wanted to avoid at all costs.
Ellsberg gave these documents to Neil Sheehan, a New York Times reporter. The documents were published quickly on the front page of the Times on June 13, 1971, who was immediately pressured by the United States government under the Nixon administration to halt all publication.
Well, what's being done about it then? I mean, I would think, how do you go about it? You do it sort of low-key. Low-key, you call them and then send a telegram to confirm it. Say that we're examining the situation and we just simply are putting you on notice.
The Washington Post under Katharine Graham published the documents in response to this order, and soon after came a wave of dozens of other newspapers publishing them.
The New York Times versus United States case was, in essence, a fight to see if the government would begin restricting what the press could publish or if the press would retain its full First Amendment rights. Nixon led the side that believed Ellsberg and the Times should be punished. Many people believed Ellsberg was a criminal that should be in jail. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that limiting or restricting publication was unconstitutional and therefore that the New York Times had the right to publish the Pentagon Papers.
Despite it being a triumph for the newspapers and the people, Nixon still believed that Ellsberg should face punishment and continued to have a strong hatred toward him. Nixon went so far as to hire hitmen to attack Ellsberg in retaliation for him leaking the Pentagon Papers.
These actions are similar to those taken by Nixon later in his presidency when he attempted to silence reporters on the Watergate scandal through threats and violence. Nixon's threatening behavior towards the press following the publication of the Pentagon Papers continues into Watergate. This was shown by his threats of murder and harm towards Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward.
The publication of the Pentagon Papers caused great backlash. The public immediately lost trust in the government. Many people who still supported the Vietnam War turned against it. More protests took place with more protesters there. More newspapers and news stations reported the horrors in Vietnam. The government had immediately lost support for the war.
So anytime they withhold information from us, you got to ask yourself, what are they hiding? Why are they hiding? Why don't we see more publicity? Why don't we see more open and transparent operations in the government? And that's the tragedy. It's our stuff, but we're not allowed to see it. It's the public's information, but they're not allowed to see it. And that's the tragedy of the way the government works.
Because of the triumph in the New York Times versus United States court case, newspapers retained their freedom in publishing and aren't sued for criticizing the government. People rely on newspapers more for the raw truth that the government doesn't always give. Because of newspapers not having to face prior restraint and censorship, the press is still a powerful source of information that the public desperately needs.
More people distrust the government and question what officials tell them. More investigations of public officials occur. People are extremely opposed to the government limiting freedom of the press. Because of the outbreak of anger at the government for keeping important information secret, more government information is publicized. The full Pentagon Papers were opened to the public by the National Archives in 2011.
The New York Times' triumph in the Supreme Court confirmed the belief that criticism of the government doesn't constitute a clear and present danger to the safety of the United States. This notable triumph that guaranteed the protection of freedom of the press is still a fundamental concept in modern-day America.
Many presidents have tried to limit free press. In 2018, Donald Trump attempted to silence CNN reporter Jim Acosta by revoking his White House press pass. This sparked outrage throughout the nation and resulted in Acosta retaining his pass after the case CNN versus Trump.
From President Nixon's attempt to silence reporters on his infamous Watergate scandal to President Trump trying to ban Jim Acosta's White House press pass, government attempts to censor news occurs to this day.
However, because of the precedent set by the New York Times Company versus United States case, journalists, reporters, and writers are able to speak out against the government and utilize their rights to create a better America.